There was a man who once wrote the saddest soul of the Byrds, yet left the very band just as they were touching the sky. Gene Clark did not lack talent, did not lack opportunity, and did not lack the moments that made an entire generation stop and listen. The strange thing was this: the closer he came to glory, the more he seemed to want to disappear. He had a fragile voice, eyes that always seemed to be hiding a storm, and a gift for songwriting that turned ordinary loneliness into something haunting. But behind those painfully beautiful songs was a man torn apart by fear, pressure, alcohol, broken relationships, and the feeling that he was always standing in the wrong place in his own life. Gene Clark was once one of the most important creative minds in American folk rock, yet he never received the recognition he deserved while he was alive. He watched his friends soar higher while he remained trapped between unfinished tours, forgotten albums, and a heart that grew more and more exhausted. This is not only the story of a gifted musician, this is the journey of a man who could touch other people's souls through music, but could not save his own. Why did Gene Clark, the man who once stood so close to legend, finally leave this world in loneliness and regret? Gene Clark was born on November 17, 1944, in the town of Tipton, Missouri, with the birth name Harold Eugene Clark. He was the third child in a family of 13 siblings. In a home always filled with the sounds of children and the daily chores that had to be done, music was a familiar part of life. His father played guitar and loved country music. After work, he would often take out his guitar and play familiar songs for the whole family to hear. Gene was drawn to those sounds from a very early age. Around the age of 9, he got his first guitar and began learning basic chords under his father's guidance. Not long after that, the boy also learned the harmonica and spent more and more time with music. At first, Gene played the songs he loved. Then, little by little, he began changing the lyrics, altering the melodies, and trying to write ideas of his own. While many friends his age dreamed of standing on stage, Gene became increasingly fascinated by the work that happened before a performance began. Sitting alone with his guitar, searching for a new melody, or writing a few more lines for an unfinished song. Recordings by Hank Williams, the Carter Family, Elvis Presley, and the Everly Brothers passed through Gene's childhood one after another. Country, folk, and rock and roll all existed together in the musical world he grew up with. As he entered his teenage years, he joined local bands, rehearsed with friends, and looked for every opportunity to perform in front of an audience. One of his first bands was Joe Myers and the Sharks, where Gene had the chance to record the song Blue Ribbon. After that, he continued playing with the Rum Runners and several other groups around the Missouri area. Weekend nights gradually passed on small stages, in local halls, and at community dances, where Gene had more chances to experiment with his own songs. In the late 1950s, the folk revival wave spread across America and quickly attracted Gene. He and his friends formed the group Surf Riders and began performing regularly around the Kansas City area. By the early 1960s, Surf Riders had built enough of a reputation to draw attention from outside Missouri. In 1963, Randy Sparks, the founder of New Christy Minstrels, happened to see Gene perform and offered him a place in the band. It was not only a new job, but also Gene's first chance to step out of his familiar world. That invitation took the young man away from Missouri and into the world of professional music. After leaving Missouri in 1963, Gene Clark entered the professional music world when he joined New Christy Minstrels, one of the most successful folk groups in America at the time. The opportunity came from Randy Sparks after he saw Gene perform with Surf Riders. The 18-year-old young man left Tipton with his guitar, a few songs he had written himself, and began a new life on long tours across America. Large concert halls gradually replaced local stages. Stage lights, footsteps behind the wings, and buses stretching across state lines became the constant rhythm of his life. One city followed another, one performance followed the next, with little pause between appearances before the audience. In the large lineup of New Christie minstrels, Gene mainly sang harmony. His own songs rarely appeared in the performance set list. After each night's show, while the noise of the group still lingered in hotel corridors, he often stayed behind with his guitar and unfinished drafts. The small room, the dim light, and the sound of guitar strings became a more familiar space than the collective stage. Amid the packed schedule, the rare stretches of time on the road were filled with practicing guitar and writing music. Conversations about music appeared more often than gatherings after the show. The guitar was always near the hotel bed, like a fixed stopping point between constant movements. By late 1963, the Beatles' singles began to ring out everywhere. She Loves You and I Wanna Hold Your Hand appeared on the radio, in airport waiting rooms, and even backstage. Those recordings followed Gene from city to city. While New Christie Minstrel's touring schedule still kept its familiar folk rhythm, he began spending more time with the electric guitar and with ideas that lay somewhere between folk and rock and roll. In early 1964, Gene left New Christie Minstrels and moved to Los Angeles. There was no clear plan ahead, only a change in direction after months of constant touring. A few months later, he met Jim McGuinn in a musical setting that was still taking shape. From small rehearsals, experimental harmonies, and ideas that did not yet have a name, the road leading to the Byrds began to form. In the summer of 1964, Gene Clark met Jim McGuinn in Los Angeles. Both of them were trying to find a new direction at a time when the folk movement and the British invasion wave were exploding at the same time. Their conversations quickly turned into rehearsals. David Crosby appeared not long after that, then Chris Hillman and Michael Clark. From an unnamed group, the Byrds gradually began to form. In the early days, Gene was often the one who brought songs to the rehearsal room. Notebook after notebook was filled with new lines of lyrics and melodies. While the other members were still defining their roles, Gene almost already knew what he wanted to write. His compositions helped the Byrds soon have material of their own, instead of relying only on the adaptations that were popular at the time. When Mr. Tambourine Man was released in 1965, everything changed almost overnight. The song topped the charts in both America and Britain, and the Byrds became one of the most talked-about names in new rock music. But behind Bob Dylan's hit, Gene was still quietly leaving his own mark. I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better and Here Without You quickly showed that the band did not only have successful adaptations, but also possessed a true songwriter. The following months passed at a dizzying speed. Airplanes, hotels, studios, and stages followed one another with almost no break. Every time the band needed a new song, Gene brought in another draft. While the public was beginning to know the Byrds, people inside the industry also began to pay attention to Gene Clark. Many believed he was the most outstanding songwriting talent in the group. Success brought money faster than anyone had imagined. Because most of the Byrds' original compositions carried Gene Clark's name, the royalties he received were significantly higher than those of the other members. On paper, that was completely reasonable. In reality, it caused the atmosphere inside the group to gradually change. Silent distances began to appear right when the band was at its peak. Another paradox also formed during this period. While Gene's name appeared more and more often in the songwriting credits, Roger McGuinn appeared more and more often before the public. Audiences remembered the round glasses, the 12-string Rickenbacker guitar, and the man standing in the center of the stage. Gene was the person who wrote the most songs, but he was not the face of the band. The distance between contribution and presence became increasingly clear. At the same time, his fear of flying continued to cling to him. When the Byrds were still a local band, that problem was not truly serious. When the tours stretched across America, everything became completely different. One city had just ended when another city was already waiting ahead. What the other members saw as ordinary work became a constant source of pressure for Gene. On the outside, Gene Clark was living the life that countless young musicians dreamed of. His name appeared on best-selling songs, Audiences cheered every time the Byrds stepped onto the stage, and royalties kept flowing in from the songs he had written. Each flight began with the familiar feeling of tension. While the other members slept or talked, Gene often sat silently looking out the window or tried to focus on a magazine in his hands. After the shows, he was rarely the one who stayed the longest at parties. Many nights ended in a hotel room with a guitar resting on his knees and an open notebook beside him. After each round of touring, Gene returned to his notebooks. A song that had just been completed often quickly gave way to the next song. An album that had just been released led to new ideas waiting to be written. By early 1966, the Byrds were standing in a position that most young bands could only dream of. But the flights continued. The internal disagreements were still there, and the machine around the band was moving faster and faster. What had once brought excitement now began to feel heavy. Gene still stepped onto the stage every night, still wrote new songs, but the thought of leaving was no longer too far away. In 1966, the Byrds released Fifth Dimension. At the center of the album was 8 Miles High, a song co-written by Gene Clark, Roger McGuinn, and David Crosby. The sound of the song was completely different from what was playing on the radio at the time. Many years later, it would be seen as one of the milestones that opened the way for psychedelic rock. The Byrds were going further creatively than ever before. Ironically, that was also the moment when Gene began thinking about leaving. The disagreements within the band were still there. His fear of flying had not eased. The life of a rock star increasingly made him feel suffocated. In March 1966, Gene Clark left the Byrds. The news was shocking because the band had just created the biggest successes of its career. The first person to walk out of the group was the very man who had written most of the songs that had brought them to that position. When the door closed behind him, Gene carried with him a respected reputation, a talent that had been recognized, and instabilities that had never truly disappeared. Those very things would shape the rest of his life. Many years later, friends and colleagues still recalled his fear of flying as one of the things that changed Gene Clark's life. When he left the Byrds in 1966, the band was at a creative peak, and 8 Miles High had just opened a new direction for their music. The day Gene left the Byrds, an important chapter closed. There would be reunions later, but nothing was ever like those first years again. The early years after leaving the Byrds were a series of consecutive new beginnings. Gene released Gene Clark with the Gosden Brothers, formed the Gene Clark Group, and continued searching for his own direction. Some critics gave him positive praise. His colleagues still saw the songwriting talent that had once helped bring the Byrds to the forefront of America. But public attention did not follow those reviews. There were no longer crowds waiting outside the studio doors or sold-out tours as before. Each new project seemed to have to begin again from zero. In the following years, Gene collaborated with Doug Dillard and went deeper and deeper into the combination of country, bluegrass, and rock. It was the kind of music he truly wanted to pursue, even though it was quite different from what had once brought the Byrds onto the charts. The albums by Dillard and Clark received respect from musicians and from a loyal group of listeners. But the distance between respect and commercial success remained intact. As the 1960s came to an end, what he had once hoped for after leaving the Byrds still had not become reality. His first solo album did not make a significant impact. New projects continued to appear and then end without bringing a turning point. 3 years earlier, Gene Clark had still been standing in a band that owned a #1 song in America. Now, once again, he had become a man trying to rebuild his career from the beginning. After many years of searching for his own direction since leaving the Byrds, Gene Clark entered the early 1970s with a career that was becoming increasingly difficult to define. He was still recording, still writing, and still being mentioned by people in the music world with special respect. But the gap between reputation and reality grew larger and larger. The songs Gene had written from the mid-1960s were still being played on the radio. Meanwhile, his new albums appeared and then quietly disappeared from the market. Mornings in Mendocino often began with sea fog covering the hills along the coast. Gene woke up later than he had during his touring years, made coffee, and sat for hours beside the guitar placed near the window. There was no constant ringing telephone in the house as there had been during the years in Los Angeles. There was no manager, no interview schedule, and no one asking him about this week's position on the charts. Most of the time, there was only the sea, the notebooks, and the unfinished songs. White Light was born from that period. The album was released in 1971 with a sound so simple that it was almost the complete opposite of what was happening on the charts. There was no ambition to create a hit single. There were no elaborate layers of production. There was only Gene's voice, the guitar, and the songs he believed were the most honest he had ever written. But most of the American public almost did not hear them. The album received some praise from critics and found loyal supporters in Europe, especially in the Netherlands. In his homeland, it passed by almost without leaving a trace. The following years were not much different. Roadmaster had difficulties from the moment it was released. While country rock was becoming more and more popular and attracting large audiences, Gene still stood outside that wave of success. In 1973, the Byrds reunited with their original lineup. In the eyes of the public, it was a long-awaited reunion. The final album was still completed and released, but the reunion did not open any new chapter. After that, the members continued on their separate paths again. Nearly a decade had passed since the day Gene left the Byrds. Projects came and went. Praise still appeared. The success he had been waiting for did not. No Other gradually became more than just a new album. It was a chance for Gene to prove that the path he had been following all those years was not a dead end. After that, Gene returned to Mendocino and began what would become No Other. Ideas appeared in notebooks, on demo tapes, and during long nights beside the guitar. The songs spoke of faith, love, loneliness, time, and the things that could not be taken back. They carried almost everything he had gone through since the day he walked out of the Byrds. As the project moved deeper into the studio, its scale also grew larger and larger. Gene kept adding musicians, harmonies, and new layers of arrangement. The mixes were redone again and again. Production costs rose beyond expectations. The people around him began to worry about the budget. Gene kept working. After nearly a decade of watching his projects be ignored, he did not want to compromise anymore. No Other was released in 1974. The album was unlike anything on the radio at the time. It was too long, too complex, and too unusual for the market. Sales quickly proved disappointing. The record label cut back its promotional support. Discussions about commercial success quickly came to an end. In only a short time, the project Gene had spent years pursuing was almost pushed to the margins. Many years later, No Other would be seen as one of the forgotten masterpieces of American rock. Critics returned to the album. New generations of musicians began to speak of it with special respect. But in 1974, Gene could not see that future. What he saw was only a recording studio with the lights turned off, an album that could not find its audience, and once again, the need to return from a place he had once hoped would be a new beginning. After the failure of No Other, Gene Clark once again fell into a familiar situation. While rock music moved toward new trends and new faces kept appearing, Gene increasingly appeared more in the conversations of musicians than on the charts. In 1977, he released Two Sides to Every Story. The album received positive responses but did not create the turning point he had been waiting for. Around the same time, Gene began touring more regularly and gradually gained control over the fear of flying that had followed him for many years. Performances with Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman quickly led to the creation of McGuinn, Clark, and Hillman. Their 1979 debut album brought Gene the clearest commercial success he had had in many years, with singles that received considerable attention on the radio. But that feeling of revival did not last. The 1980 album City could not repeat the earlier success, and the differences in musical direction became increasingly clear. After leaving McGuinn, Clark, and Hillman, Gene continued working on other projects, including Flight. None of them made a significant impact or brought him back to the position he once had. By the early 1980s, Gene's name had almost disappeared from the charts. But while he was gradually moving away from the spotlight, his older albums began to find a new generation of listeners. By the mid-1980s, Gene Clark had almost disappeared from the mainstream current of American rock. But right at that moment, his old recordings began appearing in the record collections of a new generation of musicians. Members of REM, the Long Riders, and many artists from the Paisley Underground movement often mentioned him as an important source of inspiration. Albums that had once sold slowly and quickly disappeared from the market were now being passed from one young musician to another as recordings that had to be heard. Gene continued to record. Firebird was released in 1984 with the participation of Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman. The album did not create a major turning point. Some disputes related to the name The Byrds continued to appear during this period. Old disagreements had not completely disappeared, even as the band's influence was being recognized more clearly. In 1989, Tom Petty released a version of I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better, the song Gene had written for the Byrds nearly a quarter of a century earlier. In early 1991, that journey led to a special moment. The Byrds were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Nearly 3 decades after those first days in Los Angeles, Gene once again stood beside Roger McGuinn, David Crosby, Chris Hillman, and Michael Clark on the same stage. The man who had once been the first to leave the band now appeared with his old friends at a ceremony looking back on history. The years of separation, disagreement, and controversy still belong to the past. And on that evening, the 5 men who had helped change American music stood beside one another one more time. Chris Hillman repeatedly referred to Gene as the creative force of the band in its early years. Albums that had once been forgotten were looked back on with greater respect, while songs that had once passed by almost unnoticed continued to find new listeners. In 1970, Gene Clark married Carly McCummings and moved to Albion, a small community on the Mendocino coast in Northern California. After many years of living between airports, hotels, and recording studios that were always lit up, he left Los Angeles behind to begin a different life. The coastal road leading to Albion was not as crowded as Sunset Boulevard. There were no meetings with record labels, no packed promotional schedules, and no parties lasting until morning. There was only the sound of waves, mist-covered hills, and a home where Gene hoped he could slow down. The early years were a rare, peaceful period in his life. Kelly and then Kai were born one after another. Friends remembered that Gene always liked talking about his children more than talking about work. He could spend hours playing with them in the yard or taking them down to the nearby beach. People who visited Albion often saw Gene in moments very different from the image of a famous musician. Sitting on the porch watching the children run and play in the yard, fixing something in the house, or spending an entire afternoon simply being with his family. In those moments, he was not a man chasing success or trying to hold on to his place in the music industry. He was simply a father. Carly saw different sides of Gene that the public rarely knew. He was funny, gentle, and always ready to help those close to him. But she also witnessed the long silences after each time a project failed to succeed. There were days when Gene sat for hours with the guitar in his hands and barely said anything. New songs still appeared, but along with them came a growing sense of disappointment. Gene knew he was respected in the music world. Musicians still came to the songs he had written, and critics had never completely turned their backs on him. The slow-selling albums, the opportunities that kept slipping away, and the feeling of always standing very close to recognition, but never truly touching it, were still there. Each time new sales figures were sent to him, the praise appeared first. The audience did not. During some periods, alcohol and drugs became part of the way Gene faced pressure. At times, he tried to control everything by throwing himself into songwriting. At other times, he tried to forget it all in long-running parties. Those close to him still saw in him the familiar gentleness and generosity, but they also noticed the periods when Gene found it increasingly difficult to find the peace he had once hoped Albion would bring. The breakdown of the marriage did not begin with one major argument or one single event. It came much more slowly. The things that were not spoken aloud accumulated over the years. Small distances gradually became larger distances. By the late 1970s, the marriage came to an end. When the marriage ended, Gene did not only lose his life partner, he also lost the life he had once hoped would become a long-term place to rest. Albion had been chosen as a new beginning after the upheavals of the Byrds. That place had once held family, peace, and the sense of belonging he had been searching for a very long time. Now, what had seemed like the most stable thing in that life was no longer intact. Even so, his love for Kelly and Kai never changed. Friends said Gene always kept photographs of his children with him and often mentioned them in conversations. In the later years, when bands broke apart, projects came and went, and opportunities continued to pass before his eyes, he still followed his children's lives with the quiet pride of a father. Albion had once been chosen as a place to begin again. The marriage did not last, but the memory of the house by the sea remained as part of a rare period when Gene felt he had found a place to belong. By the late 1980s, the problems Gene Clark had carried with him for many years began to leave more visible consequences on his body. His struggles with alcohol and drugs, his irregular lifestyle, and his prolonged health problems had worn down his physical strength over time. To those close to him, that change became increasingly difficult to hide. Gene still continued to write, still talked about music and the plans ahead, but his body was no longer as healthy as before. Many years of alcohol and drug abuse, along with long-lasting cardiovascular problems, had left consequences that his body found increasingly difficult to withstand. The notebooks still lay around the house. Ideas for new songs appeared on loose pieces of paper, the backs of envelopes, or anything that happened to be near his hand at the time. Gene and Carla Olson still often talked about future projects. After many years of watching his albums pass by quietly, he began to witness a generation of younger artists returning to the recordings that had once been forgotten. For the first time in a very long while, the future seemed to open a few more doors again. The year 1991 began in that atmosphere, with plans still being discussed and songs still not yet completed. On May 24, 1991, Gene Clark was found dead at his home in Sherman Oaks, California. He was 46 years old. The official report determined that the cause of death was related to a bleeding stomach ulcer and serious cardiovascular disease. The news shocked his family, friends, and many colleagues in the music world. Only a few months earlier, Gene had still appeared in public and spoken about his plans for the future. Tributes quickly appeared after his death. Roger McGuinn, Chris Hillman, David Crosby, and many other colleagues all recalled Gene's role in the early years of the Byrds. Carla Olson remembered a man who always thought about music and rarely stopped writing. Those who had worked with Gene did not only remember the songs he left behind, but also remembered his almost unchanging dedication to the work. Gene Clark was buried in Tipton, Missouri, not far from where his childhood had begun. The journey that had taken him through major stages, famous recording studios, brilliant successes, and more than a few disappointments, finally closed in the place where everything had once begun. When Gene died, most of the important reassessments of his music still lay ahead. Albums that had once been overlooked would later be seen differently. New generations of artists would continue to mention him as an important source of inspiration. But that recognition came too late. Gene was no longer there to witness it all. Most of the recognition given to Gene Clark appeared long after those songs had been written. Many years after their release, albums that had once passed by quietly were found again by generations of listeners who had never lived through the era that created them. Those songs did not carry the slogans of one specific period. They spoke of journeys, farewells, homesickness, and the feeling of always searching for a place to belong. Time changed many things around them, but it did not make those emotions grow old. Some artists are remembered because they defined an era. Gene Clark left his mark in a different way. His music continues to be discovered by people who never knew him while he was alive, as if the journey inside those songs has never truly ended. Gene Clark spent almost his entire adult life on the road. From Tipton to Los Angeles, from tours with New Christie Minstrels to the years with the Byrds, and then the projects that followed one after another, he was always in a state of movement. At times, he came very close to the center of American music. At other times, he stood completely outside it. In the end, Gene returned to Tipton, the small town where everything had once begun. The journeys had come to an end, but his music had not. It still continues to travel, from one listener to another.